Greetings, welcome to a tutorial on the start of our photo class, Leah. And so I was not able to record. I ran out of room on my phone for uh, uh, I ran out of space on my phone to record. So I'm going to record this via a desktop, and then which should be able to give me a few more options as well as to show you what you missed in class for demonstration on the computer. And so getting right into this, I'm going to kind of go a little speedier than I was able to in a larger group setting. But this is the itinerary. I believe I emailed it to you. Yeah, I did. Um, and we're going to be working off this. This is our working document um, for the rest of the 3 days that we'll be in class. The first thing we did was, how modern cameras work. And the biggest thing, and that's not the right document. Silly me. This one. Anyway, we talked about the 6 major things that make your camera work to get a decent image. And the first one is meter, aperture, focus, shutter speed, ISO, and white balance. The supplemental things to get a good picture is good lighting, having a subject, something to shoot, framing your subject, and that's done in the viewfinder when you're aiming the camera at the subject, and then the elements and principles of design and portraiture. And so last night we started right away into the big 3, and I don't know what camera you're using, and so I would assume that you're probably going to be using a Canon. I do not know for sure, but working on shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. The first thing that we talked about actually was ISO, and that's something that is something difficult to explain at times. The biggest part of it is back in the old days when you had film, you had different kinds of films and brands like Kodak, Fujifilm, Ilford, and each one of those brands had their film, and they were rated at the sensitivity of the film, and that was rated in ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and when you pop in some ISO 100 film into a film camera, it doesn't absorb light as readily as you would normally see it. Let's open this up. ISO 200 absorbs light a little more quickly, and this applies whether you're on film or on digital. And I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. As you can see from this Pinterest example that I've got, when you're shooting in automatic, your camera adjusts for you. When you're shooting in manual, and that's what we're going to be getting into, when you're shooting in manual, and you adjust just the ISO on an exposure, you're setting the sensitivity of the sensor to where it doesn't absorb light as readily, and so it's going to be dark. The further up the scale of the ISO that you set on your camera increases the amount of light that it's absorbing. Here's 2000, 3200. A lot of cameras claim that they'll go up to 6400 nowadays, current ones. And it's notable that this was shot at an aperture of f5.6 in the lens at 1/200th shutter speed. We'll get into that a little bit later. So basically adjusting, and this goes for any of the big 3, adjusting the settings up or down lets you take in less or more light. And so with that, there's caveats. When you shoot at a lower ISO, you're getting a cleaner image. When you shoot at a higher ISO, you're going to introduce what's called more noise into the image. And what I mean by that is simply this. I'm going to go to my Facebook page to show an example of what high noise looks like. and I'll actually show you a couple of examples from film. I have to go to poker.com. I'm at school, after school here shooting, so I gotta, there we go. So let me go back into my profile here. I'm going to go to my photos. And go to albums. And let's go into all the way at the bottom. Classic example of Anna. Anna Jane. I love the nose picking picture. These pictures were shot on film, on Kodak. Let's see, there's Kodak film, and I think it was like an ISO 800. So it's good for low light situations. So if I'm shooting a church or a reception and there's dim lighting, I'm going to be putting my camera's sensor sensitivity set to a high ISO, like ISO 1000 or higher, anywhere up to ISO 3200. It just depends. The higher that I get, and let's zoom in on this, the higher that I get, you can see there's more noise and artifacts in here. In digital, it's called noise. In film, it's called grain. And it's ironic that both have kind of a similar effect with ISO, going from an analog state to a digital state. But and these are still film, I scan them in. This is a picture that's digital, and it's shot at a low ISO, and you can tell how clean it is. There's very little noise in the image. As you go through here, this was shot on film, and there's a high amount of noise. And I shouldn't say noise, I should say grain, a lot of film grain. The reason why that is that on film, very similar to digital, when you set the sensitivity higher, chemically the film absorbs light better, and so, but as a result, you get a grainy look to your image. And some people actually like the look of that. I don't mind it at all. That's why I shoot film still quite a bit. So that's the story behind that. Let's see. And this was shot at the Butterfly House several years ago. This was shot digitally, but with the good amount of light in here, you can tell that it's a very clean image, not a lot of digital noise in there. And so the best thing you could do on your camera is to go into your menu, and let's start a new tab, and look up changing Canon ISO. And let's say you've got a T5i. I have no idea what you have, but it'd be easy to look up those settings. Actually, in here, there should be a way to, you go into the menu of your camera and change your ISO. The top of the dial, and I should open up SketchUp here. I've got a digital 3D layout that I found for you. And it's not a B-2 bomber. That was actually for a school thing. But here I wanted to find an unbranded DSLR camera. And so on your camera, right here, I want you to switch your dial to M. Now there's no nomenclature, there's nothing on here. But what I want you to do is to find the M for manual and switch your dial to M. In your menu settings, in your one of your menu buttons around here, somewhere on the back panel say menu, go in your menu and I want you to find your ISO settings. And I want you to change your ISO. And I want you to leave your manual setting. And this is something that we did hand in hand. And if you're not comfortable with this, this is something that you and I can meet offline maybe a little bit before class tomorrow to get caught up as far as the settings on how to change your manual settings. But if you're fortunate enough to be able to change the manual settings, change your shutter speed to like 1/100th of a second, and change your aperture and your lens to like f5.6 or f1. I'm sorry, to f1, to like f3.5. Either way, when you get those set, what you're able to do then is lost my train of thought. Is I want you to go in the menus and start shooting like an ISO 100, and then start shooting all the way up, and to get the look of what it happens when you change your ISO settings. And if you leave everything else manually, like your shutter speed and your aperture, everything will start out dark, and the higher you go for ISO, the lighter it'll get. But then if you zoom in on your image, you'll notice the noisier your image will be, and you'll really see a lot of digital noise in there. And so moving right along, I don't need that. Back to my beauties. So that was the practical exercise that we ran into yesterday. There we go. Of ISO. The second thing that we got into was shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is best explained inside the camera. Go back to SketchUp here. Shutter speed, ISO is found inside your camera, and the sensor of your camera, some people wonder what this little symbol is. That's where the focal plane is. That's where the sensor is actually along this plane back here. So if you draw an imaginary line and slice this open, that's where the sensor would be. On the inside, right in front of that sensor, so right behind the lens, and right in front of the sensor is the mirror. And the mirror will lock up, and then the shutter opens and closes. And so let's take a look at what the shutter actually looks like. We can take a look at what a sensor actually looks like as well. And while we're looking for images, we'll take a look at, see if we can find anyway. We can find a lot of effects of what the shutter speed is. Let's do another search for camera shutter. And if you're following along at home, you can do certainly a search for this at home. Ooh, look at this. These are all lens shutters. Here we go. First of all, here's a camera sensor. When everything flips up and everything opens up, here's what collects light. In the old days, you could change film. However, in your camera, you have one sensor, and you can't change that sensor out. Here's an old. This is an old Nikon F. Look at that. Nice. The shutter curtain. There's two shutter curtains: a first curtain and a second curtain. And when they open, I mean, you've obviously seen this on cameras back in the day. I know I have. Is you saw this curtain, and when you press the shutter release, the button, the shutter opens up and it closes. Dependent upon how fast the shutter opens and closes, here's a cleaner image of what these blades look like. They rock up and down. If I take a long exposure, here's an even better example right here of the shutter mechanism. When I have a fast shutter speed, the shutter opens and closes extremely quick. Fast shutter speeds range anywhere from like 1/4000th of a second all the way up to, relatively speaking, like 1/500th of a second. 1/125th of a second could be considered fast, at least fast enough. Slower shutter speeds get different effects. Now, going back to the Chris Martin home viewing library here, some of the best examples of slow shutter, and basically when you see a slow shutter, it'll or when you hear it, it'll sound click, click. It opens, absorbs light, and then closes. Definitely great for low light situations where there's not a lot of movement, but when there is movement, you get some remarkable results. Here I set my camera up on a tripod, and I used a remote control, and when I saw the charge go up, or when I saw the detonation on the ground, I hit the shutter release remotely. The shutter opened wide up, and it was probably open for maybe 10-12 seconds, maybe more, maybe less. And then it exploded, and as the light was, as these charges were beaming out, those imprints make their impression on the sensor. And so here's one I did at a long exposure, just a really tight crop of it. I printed this out on an aluminum print, and it turned out very, very electric almost, if you will. Very cool. And then I think the next one I've got was kind of the final shebang. So very cool. That's a slow shutter. If I was to go into another example of slow shutter, when Nikki and I went to Hawaii last year, walking down the streets of Waikiki, I set my camera up on a mailbox downtown, and I let the exposure go for probably about 5 to 10 seconds, anywhere from there. I set it on something stationary and fired this, and as the cars drove by, it just looked like a neon electric blue. And notice, you see some people who are standing around, some people have some blur to them, even have enough time for the green light and the red light at the same time, which is kind of a funny effect. But yeah, and there's enough blur in the trees, the motion of the trees, that the trees look blurry. So that's the effects of a slow shutter speed. When I get into, let's say, a fast shutter speed, this guy was drumming. I didn't capture his motion, I just captured his emotion somewhat. And so I froze him in time by using a fast shutter speed, because he was banging on his drums, pretty well and pretty fast. But by slowing or by speeding up the shutter speed to, let's say, 1/500th of a second or faster, I'm going to be able to stop motion. Same thing here. Here I've got this guy dancing, and it was bright enough to where I was able to capture and freeze the motion. Same thing here. This guy was dancing and clapping. I had to use a very fast shutter speed because it was very bright out. If I used a slower shutter speed, it would have been too bright and overexposed. Here's a perfect example of being able to show action but yet freezing your subject. Here I used a moderate shutter speed to where, and I'd have to look at the settings of this, but it was towards twilight hour to where the sun was going down, and my shutter speed was fast enough to catch them motionless and still, but it shows action by just showing a little bit of blur, and that's okay sometimes in photos. In fact, that's not bad at all. You get some really neat effects out of that. Some people do it with light painting, where they'll do a long exposure of like doing sparklers, and they whiz sparklers all over the place, and that's what you get. You get the light painting on the sensor. But keep in mind, if it's slower shutter speed, you have to have a tripod. You have to keep your camera stationary. And so, any other examples? No. So, no. Dancing, but yet still pretty motionless, and that's fine. I captured these images more as they posed. It was more of a posed type of shot, so I didn't show any action whatsoever on that. So, all right. So that shutter speed. A lot of times when you shoot in auto, the camera will choose a somewhat fast shutter speed, fast enough to capture image. The reason why you get blurry photos of children and bear with me on a lot of times parents in their house, they're trying to take a picture and they get this effect where it's just really blurry. Inside, when you choose automatic settings for your camera, the camera says, hey, it's really dark in here. I need to slow the shutter speed down to get a decent exposure. So it's properly exposed. There's enough light here, but the shutter speed was so slow that the camera chose that you're getting these blurred images. Ways to combat that is to use a higher ISO to increase the sensitivity of the sensor, or to increase the aperture settings, the amount of light coming through the lens, and that's what we're going to get into next. So moving right along, we're going to talk about aperture. Aperture is one of those things that's controlled in the lens, not in the camera. Now, you can change the settings from the camera, but the actual aperture itself is found in the lens. So shutter speed and ISO, two things controlled in camera. Aperture is controlled in your lens. If I was to look through the middle of this lens right here, and you can't see it hardly, you would see a bunch of aperture blades, and we're going to go to the internet and look at those. Let's go back here. Just one quick. Some neat effects with a slow shutter speed where someone's standing still and you see trains go by. A good example with water, great example with water. Fast shutter speed, you can see the individuality of the water cresting over. When you go a slower shutter speed, here's 1/3 of a second as compared to 1/200th of a second, you're going to see a blurriness of the water. It's great at Falls Park if you do that. Doing a fast shutter speed will catch something like this. Excellent example once again. 1/2000th of a second, you're going to catch the individual sparks. At 1/8 of a second, those sparks turn into streaks of light, or they appear as streaks of light. And so, great examples of a fast shutter speed here to where I'm capturing individual water droplets. And this is at 1/1000th of a second. So with that, here's a good example of f-stops here. And let me get my camera shutter. These are actually all examples of your aperture. So inside your lens, here we go. Inside of your lens, you have what's called an aperture. The aperture is actually the opening. The diaphragm is what creates the opening. And so, this is a Ricoh Rikonon In fact, they also make Minolta lenses. So here's a Canon. You can see this has got a wider aperture. Your aperture, and I'm glad I brought this up, the lens tells you what the focal length is. If it's a telephoto, a wide angle, or a telephoto, or a normal lens, like this one's a normal lens, which means that it sees relatively the same field of view as the eye, the human eye. The numbers on your camera lens tell you what the maximum aperture is of the lens. This is a prime lens, meaning that you can't zoom in or out. It's got one fixed focal length right here. The maximum aperture is 1.4. That's very, very wide open, relatively speaking. Let's take a look at this. If I'm shooting a lens at f1.8 to f2.8 to f4, f5.6, f8, 11, 16, and 22. The one thing I'm going to notice with that, and here's the mechanical version of that. Each stop, now this should actually be, there should be like an f2. I wish they had f2 here and an f4, or I'm sorry, f1.4. And let's go into, let's go to my Pinterest page. Alright, and on my Pinterest page, I've got a board called Understanding How Your Camera Works. I must be at my 15-minute time limit for the, yep, we have a 15-minute limit on our bypassing the filter, so I have to go back in here. Alright, let's refresh this. Oh, come on. If not, we can go back into here. Here's an excellent example. With the numbers that you see here, every time that you see going from one stop to the other, you're letting in twice as much light as the previous stop. So at f16, I'm not letting a lot of light in. It's almost like the human eye squinting, because it makes everything sharp and in focus. And here's an even better example. When I go from f16 to f11, I'm actually letting twice as much light. There's twice as much surface area in this opening as there is here. Going from f8, from f11 to f8, I've gained twice as much surface area in light as I did at f11. f5.6, the same thing, twice as much light as before, twice as much light coming in through here as there is here. It doesn't appear that way, but surface area wise it is. Same thing at f2.8, f2, and f1.4. If you notice that these scales right here, if you take 2 times 1.4, you're going to get 2.8. 2.8 times 2 is 5.6. 5.6 times 2 is 11.2, but for the most part it's f11. And vice versa. If I go f2 times 2 is 4, times 4 is 8, or times 2 is 8, times if 8 times 2 is 16. So you can see that I jump. And every stop is twice as much light as the previous stop. That's how f-stops work. That's explaining how your camera lens works in sync, in concert with your camera. And so there's a thing called the exposure triangle. Now, before we get into the exposure triangle, let's see if I can find. Let's see. Crayons and aperture. trying to think. There's a and F stops. Not seeing what I'm looking for. When your camera's lens is open, wide open, at f1.4, right here, and I've let a lot of light in, there's a trade-off to having that. And what it creates is a very thin depth of field, meaning that, and if you wanted a good understanding of depth of field, there's some videos on YouTube that you can get into. Let's see if I can find the right one. Here we go. This is actually a pretty decent example right here. If I'm shooting my lens, my camera lens at f1.4, it's a very wide open aperture. And let's say I'm focusing right here on whatever the heck that is. Ice cream? Who knows? Or eggs? I have no idea. Anyway, this is going to be in focus to where things behind it are going to be blurry. At f4, I'm still aiming at this, but this is going to be a little more in focus than the previous. This is certainly more in focus as well. When I tighten up my aperture, it's like squinting once again, I'm going to get more items in focus. And so that's why if you're shooting a group of people, shooting them wide open can be somewhat detrimental, because if their eyes all aren't in the same focal plane, some people are going to be in focus, some people are going to be blurry. And so well, isn't that a funny picture? Anyway, so here we go. So shooting at a wide aperture, if I focus on this hippo, the rest are going to be blurred out at a wide maximum aperture. And so that's a very good way of explaining what aperture does. So aperture lets a lot of light in, but there's, I guess you would call, effects of having a wide open aperture. Just as if there's an effect of having a fast or slow shutter speed. You get different effects out of the camera. Now, moving on to the exposure triangle, we talked about yesterday how if I shoot at a high ISO, I don't have to shoot at a very wide open aperture or a very fast shutter speed or a very slow shutter speed. So if I look at my ISO, if I have a slow ISO of ISO 100, which means that I'm not letting a lot of light absorb readily onto the camera sensor, it's not gathering light into the pixels, then basically I'm going to minimize my noise. Let's see. I would have to use a wider aperture, or I'd have to use a slower shutter speed. And so, as you can see, if I increase my ISO to 1600, I would either have to tighten my aperture or increase my shutter speed. And so, if you push one way or the other, you have to increase in in the areas, or somewhere in the areas. So let's take a look at, if I go from f16 down to f2, I'm letting more light in. I'm going to have to increase my shutter speed. So, and it'd go this way. So if I'm at 1/125th of a second and I go from f16 to f2, I'm going to have to go from 1/125th of a second to, let's say, 1/1000th of a second, just to get the same exposure. The best way to play with that is to literally put your camera in manual and adjust the settings to where if I increase my ISO, I might have to decrease my or increase my shutter speed. And so, or if I decrease my or tighten up my aperture to where I'm letting less light in, I might have to slow down my shutter speed or increase my ISO. And so, and that's something it's sometimes difficult to explain, especially in like a venue like this offhand. But it's called the exposure triangle, to where if you want the same amount of light coming into this triangle, if you decrease one, you have to increase the other, and vice versa. And so, with that, let's see. Let's go back into that's aperture. Now, we didn't get into metering. We didn't get into autofocus yet. That's going to be more of a Tuesday thing. Or I'm sorry, Thursday thing. We focused a lot on that. We did have practical exercises where we broke, and then we talked about setting up shots and just practice around in the commons area at Southeast Tech of just shooting. And so some of the notes that I had, let's see, it was not very much. Some of the things that we covered, shutter speed, rule of thumb, don't shoot faster than the length of the lens. What does that mean? Earlier you saw that I had a this is a great example, which also can explain a couple other tidbits. If I'm hand holding a camera and I can hold it very, very still, and I'm shooting at a very wide open, which means that I can take a lot of the scene in, I would be able to perhaps hand hold that camera at 1/20th of a second. If I zoom in to 55 millimeters, so I'm getting closer to my subject by zooming in with the lens, and I'm at 55 millimeters, I probably don't want to go below 1/60th of a second. Why 1/60th? Because they don't have 1/55th of a second. So if I was looking at a 50 millimeter lens, that's my focal length. That's a normal lens. It's got the field of view of the human eye. A 50 millimeter lens, I probably wouldn't want to shoot. Some cameras might shoot at 1/50th of a second, or around 1/60th of a second. You could probably hand hold, without putting a camera on a tripod, you could probably hand hold and shoot at 1/50th of a second for a shutter speed, and not have it be very blurry in terms of camera shake. Now, if your subject is moving, then most likely if you're shooting at 1/50th of a second, you're going to be getting a blurry image. And so let's see, this is a 24 millimeter lens. It's got a diameter of 49 millimeters. That's for if you want to buy a protective cover, a filter for your lens. This has a maximum aperture of 1.8. And so it doesn't look as wide as some of the other examples, but it's probably stopped down a little bit, meaning that it's tight. But if you open this wide up, it's got the effective f-stop of f1.8. So this lens doesn't zoom in or out. It's a prime lens. And so with that, I probably want to go lower than 1/30th of a second, since there's no 1/24th of a second. So if that makes sense. We talked about lenses and focal lengths of lenses, and there's a calculator online called the Nikon Lens Simulator. There's also, if you're a Canon person, there's a Canon Lens Simulator. So if you wanted to see what a lens would do, this is a really neat example. Let's zoom in here. If I've got a 15 millimeter fisheye, this is what my image is going to look like. If I zoom in to 20 millimeters, I'm zoomed in more. Going to 28, 35, 50, 85, 135. Remember, this is all standing back, right back here to where I'm standing right by this area. 135, 200, 300, 400, 600, 1200 millimeters. Notice that my field of view is very narrow, and I'm able to zoom in very tight. That's standing from all the way back here. That's now, you get to this end, some of these are affordable on some cameras, especially if you have outdoor lenses. Not, some of these can get into the thousands. Like this range is your 10 to 15,000 range for cost of a lens. So most people don't get into that, except sports nuts and wildlife photographers. So let's go to I like how the Canon or the Nikon one does it a little bit better. It's the same concept. And you can try this out at home, depending upon which lenses you have. On a camera sensor, there's two different types of camera bodies for the most part for DSLRs. There's DX lenses, which are sensors, which are cropped sensors, and there's FX, which are full frame sensors. And if, let's take a look at, it doesn't really matter whether it's a Canon or Nikon, but you can see the difference between a DX sensor and an FX sensor. An FX sensor gets you more, can capture more of an image with the same lens. So if I have the same lens, 20 millimeter lens on here or 50 millimeter lens on here, I'm going to capture more detail because I actually have more to capture with. There's a crop factor between FX and DX, and it's the same between Nikon and Canon, is that this is a 36 millimeter, it's physically 36 millimeters in length, kind of like 35 millimeter film, versus the crop factor of 1.5. So this sensor is 1.5 times larger than this sensor. So knowing that, if you go back to the Nikon page here, if I shoot an FX lens of, let's say, it's a 50 millimeter lens. Okay, there's a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame body, which means that it's got a large sensor. You're going to pay a premium for that sensor. They're just naturally more expensive. But if I shoot that same lens on a FX, start it over. If I'm 50 millimeters on an FX lens on a full frame body, this is what it's going to look like. When I slap that same lens on the smaller cropped sensor, this is the actual image that I would get. It's actually going to appear closer. Why? Because I can fit more into this image, and it's going to actually make it seem like it's zooming in. So what you'll hear sometimes is that a 50 millimeter lens on an FX body is 50 millimeters. Some people say a 50 millimeter lens on a DX body is more like 75. hence 50 times 1.5. So not meant to be confusing, but it's meant to give you an understanding of that. If most people who shoot DX bodies, if they shoot with an FX lens, that it's going to be tighter. You might have to accommodate by backing up than more so than what you would normally have to do. So there is an effect that lenses have called compression. And the effects of lens compression, and we'll cover this on Thursday. Same woman, it's kind of the same size, same camera, but a different lens. This is a wide angle lens, close up to her, versus, and you can see how much distortion that lens gives, not very flattering. Same, like I said, same woman, different lens, wide angle. This is a wide angled lens. If I put a longer lens, like a 200 millimeter lens on here, I'm going to get better compression. And the compression means that it doesn't distort her face as abnormally. Here's a better example. This is one to where here we go. Oops. Oh, for pity's sake. Oh, what did I click on? I love Google searches. They're so completely random. Lens compression. There we go. Back to it. So anyway, this is with a 300 millimeter lens, and you can tell the wider angle that you get, the more distorted the woman's face gets. And so that's what compression does for a lens. So when you're shooting someone, effectively you want to have a longer lens. But there's a caveat to that. You need to have good light, an ample amount of light. Most lenses, the more you zoom in, the darker it will naturally get because it tightens the aperture. And so with that, hopefully that's a 45-minute rough sketch of what I wanted to talk about. If there's any questions, see if you and I can maybe hook up maybe half an hour before class tomorrow, just to kind of go over some things that you might have some questions on, just to kind of get you up to speed in terms of knowing what the controls are on your camera. The biggest ones that we covered were how to use your jog dial on here. And if you're using a Canon, this is more like a Canon camera. How to use your jog dial in concert with these buttons to change your aperture and your shutter speed, and then using your menu system to change your ISO. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.